For a moment, panic gripped Mitsue, locked him in place. Everything slowed. He floated, watched himself from above. Run, he thought. Run! Once more he was pounding down a burning street, the smoke sticking in his eyes. Once more shadows coalesced, hands reaching towards him, while bodies lay face down in ruby pools of blood. Run! The past and present stuck. All his terrors clotted. And he ran. People died all around him. And he ran. The scream split his ears. And he ran, and he ran, and he ran. The ground came rushing up to meet him. He wrenched the door open. What are you doing? Olivia's eyes were wide, sparkling in the light. I'm not running. Not anymore. The thought steadied him, a rock in the storm to which he held to like a drowning man. They need help, he said. Come on. He thrust his hand towards her. She stared up at him, her mouth lolling open, her head turning slowly side to side. Why didn't she understand? He had to save them, save everyone. Come on, he shouted. She blinked and grabbed his hand. Then they were running down the hall, not away from danger, but towards it, towards the screams, towards the black freight car. Mitsue threw the door at the end of the hall open and stepped out into the night. A mute wind whipped round his head. He squinted, barely able to see a few feet in front of him by the infirm glow of the flame thrashing in Olivia's hand. Ahead he could just discern the edge of the black freight car, like an extension of the night. He hesitated. Their way was now blocked. No walkway stretched between these two cars, only a gap of empty space. Flames split the night, detonations shaking the freight car, but then one last scream split the air, ending abruptly, and all was silent. I'll have to jump. He lifted one leg over the railing, then the other. The cold night air slithered past, its sting reddening his cheeks. He could see plainly now the lights of Tama only a short distance away, smoldering between the toes of the hills. His pulse thundered in his veins. His vision swam. Below the ground fell away into darkness, as if the train now crossed a great void. This is it. He took a quick breath and steeled himself for the jump. Wait! Olivia seized his wrist. She looked a pale apparition summoned from the placid dark. Fear sparkled in the pits of her eyes, and her lips were thin and bloodless. It's too dangerous. She tightened her grip. Don't. Please. She's right. He knew it. It was too dangerous. It was madness. He would be killed. Something opened in his chest. He felt space, miles and miles of it, crushing his organs to the sides, blowing out his ribcage, screaming along his spine. The truth squeezed into the fluid ringing his brain. His lungs cracked. His stomach crawled. I can't do it. I can't. Cement pooled in his extremities, stiffening, holding him still. He was a coward. He always had been. It wasn't in him to be strong, to be brave. His father faced him across the polished wood floor. Again, he said, but Mitsue hesitated. He stood before his home as it burned, unable to take another step. I can't do it. And yet, I have to. It wasn't a matter of pride, of dignity. No. He had no one to impress, and he didn't care about himself. The screams he'd heard a minute before played over in his mind, forward and backward. And they were the screams of those dying in the fire as Sotsu burned. They were the screams of the orphans in St. Trenitz as the darkness fell on them. They were the screams of his mother and his father and Ray, and the pressure of all those screams pushed out along the seams of his heart, folding the filaments outward. All his life he'd been too weak to save them. But now, he opened his palm and saw the sakura blossom seared into his skin. There was his wish. There was his power. I have to. He smiled at Olivia. It'll be okay, he said, and with that, he grabbed the lighter from her hand, the cap snuffing out the flame, and twisted from her grip, and in the dark, he jumped. He knew a moment of glorious weightlessness as the arc of his jump carried him upward. Then he slammed into the rail of the freight car, and the air was driven from his lungs. His feet slipped and he nearly fell, but then his hands caught and he steadied himself and climbed over the railing. He flicked the lighter open and sparked the butane. A thin halo of light opened like a hole in the darkness, and by it he found the door that would lead him inside. You idiot! He heard Olivia shout, and then her large frame came sailing out of the darkness. She hit the landing hard, and might have lost her grip if Mitsue hadn't dived to the edge and caught her. He pulled her up onto the platform, where she remained on her knees, panting and shaking. You idiot, she said. You absolute idiot. What are you doing? Mitsue asked. What, am I supposed to let you go by yourself? She replied hotly, rising unsteadily to her feet. Mitsue tried to help her, but she pushed him away. Though who's the bigger idiot? The idiot or the idiot who follows the idiot? She sighed. Well, go on. Lead the way. We can die together at least. Mitsue laid his hand on the door handle, and pressing down, swung it open. Light preserve us, Olivia mumbled as they saw inside. Bile rose in the back of Mitsue's throat. The cabin was dark, oppressively, terribly dark. The lighter's frail flame exposed only a thin band. But this was already too much. Like the edges of a nightmare, it seemed. Muscle fiber and viscera and lumps of flesh too finely minced to distinguish from what part of a human body they'd originated splattered the floor. Blood climbed both walls and arced across the ceiling as if the arteries and veins of its origin had been pressurized. A white sheet divided the car in half across its length. This too was splattered with gore, like parchment marked by some horrid, unknown calligraphy. One half was scorched and withered and draped the floor, exposing the rear of the car. From the depths came sharp glints of metal and glass, but nothing yet of form. Pieces of wood that might once have been furniture, a table, some chairs, slid back and forth with the motion of the train. The smell was utterly overwhelming, at once sweet and bitter and sour and sharp, and in its mixture, blood and piss and feces and bile, and all the myriad fluids that fill a person, altogether putrid. Whatever bravery or stupidity had led them here evaporated instantly at the sight and the smell. Mitsue's only thought was of getting away, but he mastered the impulse and forced his legs forward. As for Olivia, a macabre curiosity seemed now to grip her, and to prevent her flight. She crouched on her heels and began to examine the remains. It's still moist, she said, leaning over a splatter of blood. These must have been the screams we heard. But what? She paused and held her hand to her mouth as if she might be sick. She wiped her lips. But what killed them? Mitsue knew. He recognized the scene from the entrance hall of St. Trenit's. Only Noctura could do this. I think you must be right. But then, would a Noctura leave the remains? Mitsue remembered the darkness opening beneath Abbess Carmine, the flat look on her face as she dipped below the surface. No, he thought, they wouldn't leave even a drop of blood. From a pocket in her robes, Olivia produced a handkerchief. With it she gingerly turned over a piece of flesh. Attached was a tatter of white fabric, stained red, and as it faced right side up, they saw, stitched into the material, a red fireburst. A kindler, Olivia said. Or maybe two based on the volume of blood. White scrubs. They must have been doctors. She narrowed her eyes. But why were they here? Mitsue had no answer. Olivia stood and walked forward, stepping carefully between the puddles of gore. Mitsue followed, the gloom peeling slowly back before their advance, revealing ever deeper into the car. On the right, near where the divider was burned, the side door had been ripped from the wall of the train car, leaving now a gaping hole. Beyond, the black night whistled past. Solid steel, Olivia noted, running her hands along the frayed edges of the hole. This must have been the sound we heard, the force that shook through the train. She paused. It's cold, though, she said. This wasn't made by fire. She looked at him thoughtfully for a moment, then turning, she stepped past the divider. This half of the car had been spared the brunt of the damage, but for one long scorch mark that stretched up the back wall, it was unmarred. A steel table was bolted to the floor in the very center. Beside it stood a bronze IV rack cradling 2 glass vials. From each vial ran a brown tube, joining into one as they descended, and this tube now dangled an inch above the floor, pouring free a pale yellow fluid. A number of surgical implements lay in the puddle, the spindly stand where they had once rested upside down some feet away. Olivia considered each element of the room in turn. However, it was the table that held her gaze. Look, she said, pointing. Thick chains ran the length of it, passing over and under the metal slab. Something was restrained in here. A Noctura? Mitsue offered. Olivia walked around the table. She lifted a long, red strand of hair from the gleaming metal surface and held it between her fingers. I wonder. Mitsue watched the flickering shadows. He was beginning to feel that same creeping dread, like cold water down his spine. We should leave, he thought, yet even as he did, he heard it again. The child's voice, speaking just behind him. Help me,